Go back 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, each of those, I think it was the best performing asset class over that time. So it's pretty remarkable. It has been volatile, but it started from a small base, wild swings, and now it's become the best performing asset class of the last decade. It's still a lot more volatile than, say, a major fiat currency or something like that for Bitcoin. But I think that over time, as you get 1 billion, 2 billion people who have used this thing, Bitcoin will probably approach the volatility of gold, and then it may actually even get less volatile than that. There's no central bank, no central authority who's kind of changing interest rates to try to dampen the swing. So I don't think it'll be maybe as less like the US dollar at some point, but it'll be closer to gold.
Well, we think that Bitcoin is like gold 2.0.
The narrative on the street is that Bitcoin is digital gold. It's gold 2.0.
It is said to be the new gold.
In this interview, Coinbase co-founder and Chief Executive Officer Brian Armstrong discusses the next stage for Bitcoin and the cryptocurrency ecosystem by extension. Blockchains have been around since 2009. Until today, it's still a raging debate whether or not there's any real utility, especially in an industry rife with bad actors defrauding customers of unprecedented sums of money, like the recently sentenced Sam Bankman-Fried.
FTX founder Sam Bankman-Fried was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison.
Or even former Binance CEO CZ.
Hey, Scott, so Binance and its CEO plan to strike a plea deal with the DOJ. That's according to the Wall Street Journal. They're citing sources.
These critical talking points are often weaponized by detractors, some of who are rightly concerned. Today, Brian dismisses all the FUD and clears the air on why Bitcoin and cryptocurrency make sense long term. He talks about how the current system is broken and that this iteration, like all of those before it, is doomed to fail. The cracks were most evident in 2008, and every attempt to patch them since then has only kicked the can down the road. Brian explains that adoption of Bitcoin is currently the most patriotic course of action, and the only way to prevent total collapse. Let's jump right in.
The crux of the argument, and this is where people's views may diverge, but here I'll give you my perspective on it. I think that one of the most patriotic things you can do for America to ensure that Western civilization continues to flourish and that the dollar remains relevant and everything is to have a check and balance on deficit spending and high inflation. In 1971, we kind of went fully off the gold standard with Nixon, and because the dollar was no longer backed by any hard commodity, it allowed essentially unlimited inflation of the money supply. And since then, I think America has started to see challenges. There's actually a really great website, it's called WTF Happened in 1971. It just shows a whole bunch of charts that happened at that time. I'm a US patriot. I think that America is a great country. I chose to build Coinbase here in this country. I think that if we don't have a check and balance on the dollar, basically the incentive is for the supply to just be inflated away, and you can look at the history of this. Ray Dalio has a great book on this, but essentially great empires fall when they lose the financial discipline with the currency and they lose the reserve currency status. A well-run Fed could actually manage the shocks in the system and the ups and the downs. The way the incentives are set up in Congress, there's really no party right now that wants to pass a balanced budget. This is not just unique to America, by the way. It's true of every great empire. If you go back and look at the British and the Dutch and China, etc. Once you have the reserve currency status, your temptation is to abuse it and to inflate, and eventually you go too far and you lose trust in the system. And I think there needs to be an alternative, and people are kind of waking up to that. Bitcoin is provably scarce. You don't have to trust the good intentions of man or mankind or women or anything. You trust in the laws of math. They're unbreakable in that sense. It always kind of felt a little bit odd to me, or just there was a very small number of people with their fingers on the dial changing interest rates or the money supply writ large. It's like the ring of power. Like there's the potential for abuse is too tempting 100 years further on this history, but America is still, I think, the strongest country in the world, and it's the best place to do business. There's nowhere else I'd rather be. But you can see some of the strain on the system, and I do think the best way to ensure the survival of the dollar and making sure that that's a source of soft power for the US, we need a digitized dollar. The way to ensure the survival of America is to ensure that the currency is strong and we continue this American experiment. I actually think Bitcoin and crypto is really essential to that.
After the US went off the gold standard in 1971, it entered the later stages of a cycle identified by Ray Dalio. By taking us off the gold standard, Richard Nixon removed all checks and balances that gave the dollar the stability that made it the reserve currency. Without the need to back USD with any form of value, there was no longer any limit on how much could be printed. And surely ernoughh, the results are as expected. In 2008, during the housing market and ensuing financial system breakdown, we saw the true extent of this act in play with Ben Bernanke, then Fed chairman, printing an enormous amount of US dollars to patch the broken system.
The worst day on Wall Street since the crash of
The
1987.
Dow traders are standing there watching in amazement, and I don't blame them.
We're now down 43%.
Almost everything there completely wiped out. In the NASDAQ, everything and more has been completely wiped out.
Bitcoin came to light at this time as an alternative to easily printable money, and many maximalists speculate this was no coincidence. Brian, however, asserts that the important thing is to acknowledge that Bitcoin is necessary to save the system. Next, he tackles the question of why it seems Bitcoin and cryptocurrency are failing at this task.
The 18 to 40-year-old demographic is actually much more interested in crypto. They're already using it more. Actually, the majority of people in that age group in America are actively looking for alternatives to the existing financial system. They don't think it's working for them. The fees are too high, there's delays, there's unequal access. So when I go meet with members of Congress that are over 40, which is the majority of them, oftentimes they haven't personally used crypto, but their kids do and their staffers do. And so part of it is generational. It's a feature and a bug that we want to have different branches of government so nobody can have unilateral power. But what it means is it's political. You have to form these alliances. It takes a small miracle to get new laws passed. And so the government moves very slowly, and that's certainly been a barrier to innovation. In some cases, we've seen active resistance in the case that we talked about. But young people want this. They clearly understand this is the future. And there's now 52 million Americans who've used it. And so they're going to, as a constituency, that's like 3x the number of people who hold a union card. It's 5x the number of people who own an electric vehicle. I think the generation in DC is actually just starting to take notice of this is a massive voter base. It's just bad politics to be anti-crypto. You're not going to win any votes by being anti-crypto. You're actually going to turn off 52 million Americans. So I think this election in November is going to be really interesting. There's organizations like standwithcrypto.org, kind of like a grassroots movement of people who want to vote for pro-crypto candidates. There's a super PAC that we donated to along with a bunch of others called Fair Shakes, one of the largest super PACs now. So this is going to be a massive issue in this November election. DC is going to recognize that it's political suicide to be anti-crypto essentially at this point.
The current resistance to Bitcoin is short-lived and cannot go on much longer. In an interview with CNBC, Galaxy CEO Mike Novogratz said, "The American people have just voted, and they have voted that they like Bitcoin and they like digital assets. And so Washington needs to get off the stick, get off the couch, and start doing something." The shift in political sentiment is an inevitability, and Novogratz's anecdote on the matter is corroboratory evidence. Brian finishes off the interview by discussing what to expect in regards to the next phase for Bitcoin and crypto. Let's head back in.
Well, I'd say it's actually grown a lot since 2014, if that's when it was written, I think. But at that time, there was probably only maybe single-digit millions of Americans who had used crypto at that time. There's now about 52 million. By the way, globally, I think it's probably about 400 million retail merchants in the United States. Yeah. They're not going to be the earliest adopters of this. The more early adopters of it are people, basically digital payments, so online, and then it's in emerging markets. And I will say, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I actually would have thought we had made more progress to now. But still, I don't want to fully acknowledge the point that it's very small, because I think getting 400 million people in the world to use anything is actually like a really great step if you zoom out 10 years and look at the trajectory of the internet kind of through the 80s and 90s. And people start often using crypto. They want to buy a piece of it to sort of, hey, this is interesting. I might want to own a piece of the future. It's a little bit like when domain names first came out in the internet. That was kind of the early days. It's often still how people get their feet wet. Then we saw people start to use crypto for payments, and especially with US dollar-backed stablecoins and what's called layer 2, which is allowing payments to be faster and cheaper. We've started to see actually quite a bit more activity in the payment space, especially in emerging markets. More recently, we've seen people start to use crypto for a few things. One of them is called NFTs, which is essentially artists who are trying to publish their work in a digital way that they can have a relationship with their fans directly for monetization. If you make an analogy to the internet had to do a few things. First, the internet started off with just IP addresses, and those are kind of machine readable, but they're not human readable. So we needed domain names to translate to IP addresses to get that to be kind of human readable, and email addresses and things like that we could remember, not just a series of numbers. Crypto again started off with something kind of like IP addresses, like Bitcoin addresses just look like a random string of characters. We now have things that are more human readable. We had to make the names and addresses human readable. The second thing we had to do was actually get it to be more scalable. So the internet, remember, it kind of went through dial-up to broadband, and you could load like a page of text or something on dial-up. On broadband, you could start to have more interactive applications. Crypto is going through its own kind of dial-up to broadband moment. In crypto, it's called going from layer 1 to layer 2. And then the other big thing that needed to get the internet to broad adoption was the web browser. Average people, they didn't really want to be on a command line. Once there was a web browser, anybody could use it. They didn't know underneath they were using these internet protocols like HTTP and SMTP. Maybe have that moment. How do we make this easy and accessible to a broad range of people? When we look back on crypto in 5-10 years, we'll say those were kind of similar moments that led to eventually we got to a couple billion people using it every day.
Coinbase's own Layer 2 has recently been in the news for its amazing performance, scaling the Ethereum blockchain to unforeseen heights in terms of transaction speeds and costs. This is the dial-up to broadband moment Brian was referring to. Perhaps the future isn't as far as it may seem. What do you think about Brian's analysis? To see the latest in crypto news, watch this video here.